February 7th, 1943. Two German soldiers, both corporals, both 23 years old, both captured on the same day. One near Tunis, North Africa, taken by American forces. The other at Stalingrad, taken by Soviet troops. They didn't know each other. They would never meet. But their fates, determined by nothing more than where they fell, would tell two completely different stories about the same war. The American captive, Klaus Becker, spent 3 years in the Kansas prison camp. He gained 20 pounds, learned English, shared Sunday dinners with a farm family, and returned home in June 1946. He lived until 1998, raised 4 children, and told them stories about the surprising kindness of his captors. The Soviet captive, Werner Mueller, was marched east into the frozen steppes. His family received one postcard in 1944. Then silence. His wife waited. His mother checked prisoner lists for 12 years. In 1968, a researcher found his name in declassified Soviet documents. He had died of starvation in March 1943, 6 weeks after capture. He was 23 years old. 3 million German soldiers fell into Soviet hands during World War II. 1 million of them never came home. This is what happened to them. To understand the fate of German prisoners in Soviet hands, you must first understand the scale and savagery of the Eastern Front. This wasn't the war fought in France or North Africa. This was something darker, more brutal, more total than anything the Western Allies experienced. On June 22, 1941, 3 million German soldiers invaded the Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history. The Wehrmacht swept across Soviet territory with unprecedented speed and violence. Behind the combat troops came the Einsatzgruppen, death squads that murdered over 1 million civilians, mostly Jews. In the first 6 months, the German Army Command issued orders that violated every convention of war. Commissars were to be shot on sight, partisans could be hanged without trial, entire villages could be burned in reprisal. The invasion was not just a military operation. It was a war of annihilation. The Soviet Union bled. By the war's end, 27 million Soviet citizens would be dead. Entire cities were erased. Leningrad endured a 900-day siege that killed 1 million people from starvation. Belarus lost 1/4 of its entire population. The scope of suffering inflicted by German forces on Soviet territory remains almost incomprehensible. When the tide turned, when Soviet forces began their counteroffensive in late 1942, the anger was white-hot and all-consuming. Every Soviet soldier had lost family members. Every Soviet officer had seen evidence of German atrocities. The desire for revenge was not policy. It was in their bones. Werner Müller experienced this rage firsthand. On February 7th, 1943, his unit was among the last holdouts in Stalingrad, trapped in the frozen ruins of the tractor factory district. They hadn't eaten in 4 days. The temperature was 30 below zero. They had no ammunition left. When Soviet soldiers stormed their position, Müller and his comrades raised their hands in surrender. The Soviet soldiers didn't shoot them, but they didn't treat them as prisoners protected by the Geneva Convention either. The Soviet Union had never signed the Geneva Convention. In their view, Germans who had destroyed their country deserved no protection, no mercy, no consideration as human beings. Müller and 200 other survivors were stripped of their winter coats immediately. In 30 below weather, they stood in thin uniforms while Soviet troops searched them for valuables. Watches were taken. Wedding rings were pulled from frozen fingers. One German soldier who resisted was shot in the head. His body was left in the snow as a warning. Then the march began, not to a nearby camp or a collection point, but east, always east, into the vast frozen interior of the Soviet Union. The prisoners walked in columns, guarded by Soviet troops who had no food to share and no interest in sharing it, even if they had. Men collapsed from exhaustion and cold within hours. The guards didn't stop. They didn't help. They kicked the fallen bodies aside and kept the column moving. Müller walked for 17 days. He watched Mandy every single day. Some froze to death during rest stops, their bodies stiff by morning. Others collapsed while walking and were left behind. A few tried to escape into the frozen wilderness and presumably died there. No one knew where they were going. The guards wouldn't say. The horizon was endless white. Of the 200 men who began the march with Mueller, fewer than 80 reached the first transit camp. The march itself had killed more than half. This was not unusual. Historians estimate that 20 to 30% of German prisoners captured on the Eastern Front died during the initial transport to camps, before they even arrived at their final destinations. At Stalingrad specifically, 91,000 German soldiers surrendered. The march east began immediately. By the time the survivors reached camps in Siberia and Kazakhstan, thousands were already dead. The survivors were skeletal, frostbitten, and carrying diseases that would kill thousands more in the coming months. This was just the beginning. The camps that awaited German prisoners in the Soviet Union bore no resemblance to the structured, supervised facilities operating in America at the same time. While Klaus Becker was learning English and playing soccer in Kansas, Werner Mueller's comrades were dying by the hundreds in camps that functioned as little more than killing fields with barracks. The geography alone was punishment. Most camps were located in the most remote, inhospitable regions of the Soviet Union: Siberia, the Urals, Kazakhstan, the Arctic Circle, places where winter temperatures dropped to minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit, places where the ground was permafrost that never thawed, places so isolated that escape, even if possible, meant death in the wilderness. The Soviets chose these locations deliberately. The camps needed to be far from population centers, far from any possible rescue, and brutal enough that the prisoners' only thought would be survival, not resistance. Camp infrastructure reflected Soviet disregard for prisoner welfare. Barracks were crude wooden structures, often built by the prisoners themselves, with gaps in the walls that let in wind and snow. There was no heating beyond small stoves that prisoners had to fuel themselves by collecting wood, an activity that required energy they didn't have. Bunks were bare wooden planks. Blankets were thin and inadequate. In winter, prisoners slept in their clothes, huddled together for warmth, and still woke to find companions frozen to death beside them. Sanitation was medieval. Latrines were open pits that froze in winter. Water came from rivers or melted snow, often contaminated. There were no showers, no way to clean clothes, no way to maintain basic hygiene. Lice infested every prisoner. Diseases spread unchecked. Typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis killed men by the thousands. But the true killer was hunger. The starvation was systematic, calculated, and deliberate. German prisoners in Soviet camps received food rations based on their work output. Those who met their labor quotas received roughly 1,400 calories per day. Those who didn't received as little as 400 to 700 calories. For context, a center adult needs roughly 2,000 calories to maintain basic body functions. A man doing hard physical labor in extreme cold needs 3,000 or more. The rations themselves were barely food. Breakfast was hot water with a few grains floating in it, called tea but containing no actual tea. Lunch was watery soup with perhaps a few bits of cabbage or potato, sometimes with traces of fish or meat, but more often just broth. Dinner was the same soup. The daily bread ration was 300 grams, roughly 2 small slices, and this bread was often made with sawdust filler that provided no nutrition. Let that sink in. While German prisoners in American camps were receiving 4,000 calories per day, including meat, fresh vegetables, milk, and desserts, their comrades in Soviet camps were surviving on a quarter of that amount, consisting mostly of water and starch. The physical effects were immediate and horrifying. Prisoners lost weight at shocking rates. Men who'd weighed 160 pounds at capture dropped to 90 pounds within 3 months. Bodies consumed muscle tissue for energy. Faces became skulls with skin stretched over them. Eyes sank deep into sockets. Bones protruded sharply. Men looked like walking skeletons. And many didn't stay walking for long. Starvation affects more than just weight. The body begins shutting down non-essential functions. Hair falls out. Teeth loosen and fall out. Skin develops sores that don't heal. The immune system collapses, making every minor infection potentially fatal. The mind deteriorates. Memory fails, concentration becomes impossible, and eventually, the will to live simply fades. Men died not from any specific disease, but from the cumulative breakdown of every bodily system. The work requirements made survival nearly impossible. Prisoners were forced to labor 12 to 14 hours per day in conditions that would challenge well-fed, healthy men. Logging operations in Siberian forests required prisoners to fell massive trees with hand saws and axes in temperatures that froze the tools to their hands. Mining operations sent starving men into tunnels where they chipped ore with pickaxes, their bodies giving out from exhaustion and their lungs filling with dust. Railroad construction gangs laid tracks across permafrost, moving earth and stone with shovels and wheelbarrows, working until they collapsed. The quotas were deliberately set too high. A logging prisoner might be required to fell and process 3 cubic meters of timber per day. A healthy, well-fed lumberjack could meet that quota. A starving prisoner in threadbare clothes at 40 below zero could not. Falling short of quota meant reduced rations, which meant less energy the next day, which meant falling further behind, which meant even less food. It was a death spiral by design. Guards showed no mercy. They didn't see prisoners as human beings, but as fascist invaders who had destroyed their country and deserved every bit of suffering inflicted on them. Guards beat prisoners who worked too slowly. They shot those who collapsed and couldn't continue. They provided no assistance, no encouragement, no basic human acknowledgement. The message was clear. Work until you die, and then you'll be replaced by the next prisoner. Medical care was effectively non-existent. Camp infirmaries, when they existed at all, were rooms where the dying were separated from those still working. There was no medicine. Doctors, when present, had no supplies. A prisoner with dysentery might receive nothing but instruction to drink more water. A prisoner with frostbite might have blackened fingers and toes amputated without anesthesia. The procedure performed with a saw, the wound left to heal or fester on its own. Tuberculosis, which spreads rapidly in cramped, poorly ventilated barracks, killed thousands. There was no treatment, no isolation of infected prisoners, no attempt to control the spread. Some prisoners underwent medical experiments. Soviet doctors, seeking to understand the limits of human endurance or to test treatments for Soviet soldiers, used German prisoners as subjects. Men were exposed to extreme cold to study frostbite. Others were deliberately starved to measure the effects. These experiments were not widespread, but they happened, adding another layer of horror to an already nightmarish existence. The psychological toll echoed the physical. Men watched their friends die daily. They knew they were likely next. Letters from home rarely arrived. The Red Cross had no access to Soviet camps, so families back in Germany had no information about their imprisoned loved ones. The prisoners existed in complete isolation, cut off from the world, with no idea if the war was still ongoing, if Germany still existed, if their families were alive or dead. They had nothing to hope for except survival through another day. And even that hope faded as they watched themselves and everyone around them slowly dying. Werner Müller lasted 6 weeks. In late March 1943, he died in a camp in Kazakhstan. The cause of death listed in Soviet records was dystrophy, a medical term for starvation. His body was buried in an unmarked mass grave with dozens of others who died that month. His family would not learn his fate for 25 years. The numbers are difficult to comprehend, but they must be stated clearly because they represent individual human lives, each one a son, husband, father, brother lost. The Soviet Union captured approximately 3 million German soldiers during World War II. Of these, approximately 1 million died in captivity. That's a death rate of 33%. 1 in 3 German prisoners in Soviet hands did not survive to go home. Compare this to American camps. Of 400,000 German prisoners held in the United States, fewer than 2,000 died, a death rate of less than 0.5%. The difference is not a statistical anomaly. It is the difference between a system designed to maintain human life within the bounds of international law and a system designed to extract labor from human beings until they were used up and dead. The death toll varied by when and where prisoners were captured. Early captures suffered the worst. Men taken at Stalingrad in early 1943 faced death rates exceeding 90%. Of the 91,000 Germans who surrendered there, only approximately 6,000 survived to return home in the 1950s. 85,000 men died in Soviet captivity, most within the first year. The causes of death were multiple but interconnected. Starvation killed the most. Camp records, when they exist, list dystrophy or cardiac insufficiency as causes of death, medical euphemisms for bodies that simply ran out of energy to continue living. Diseases killed tens of thousands more. Typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, pneumonia. In bodies weakened by starvation, any infection could be fatal. Cold killed many, especially in the first winters, when prisoners still wore the threadbare summer uniforms they'd been captured in. Exhaustion from forced labor killed thousands who simply collapsed and never got up. And executions, though less common than the other causes, claimed many prisoners deemed guilty of war crimes, real or fabricated. The timeline of death reveals the systematic nature. The first 3 months after capture were the deadliest. Prisoners arrived already weakened from combat, the trauma of capture, and the brutal transport marches. Thrown immediately into inadequate conditions with insufficient food, their bodies couldn't adapt. Death rates in some camps exceeded 10% per month in the first winter. Those who survived the first year had slightly better chances, their bodies having somehow adjusted to near starvation conditions. But death remained a constant companion. Conditions improved marginally as the war ended and Soviet resources recovered slightly. By 1946 and 1947, death rates had dropped significantly as rations increased to barely adequate levels. But the damage was done. The vast majority of deaths occurred between 1943 and 1945, the darkest years when the Soviet Union was still fighting and had nothing to spare for prisoners it viewed as deserving of their fate. The question that must be asked is, why? Why did Soviet treatment of prisoners differ so drastically from American treatment? The answer is complex, rooted in circumstance, ideology, and deliberate policy choices. First, context matters. The Soviet Union suffered catastrophically during the war. 27 million Soviet citizens died, a number that includes both military personnel and civilians. The German invasion destroyed over 1,700 Soviet cities and towns. 70,000 villages were burned. 30,000 factories were demolished. The scorched earth left behind as German forces retreated meant millions of Soviet citizens faced starvation in the war's aftermath. The Soviet Union was devastated in ways America never experienced. The continental United States saw no combat, no occupation, no destruction. American agriculture produced surpluses. American industry thrived. The United States could afford generosity toward prisoners because the war had made America stronger, not weaker. Second, Soviet ideology played a role. The Soviet system, built on Marxist-Leninist principles, did not prioritize individual human rights in the way Western democracies claim to. The Soviet Union already operated a massive system of labor camps, the Gulag, where millions of its own citizens were imprisoned and forced to work in brutal conditions. Treating German prisoners well would have created an absurd contrast: enemy soldiers living better than Soviet citizens. The system was fundamentally built on the premise that human labor was a resource to be exploited, and German prisoners were simply added to that calculation. Third, revenge was policy. Soviet leadership, from Stalin down to local camp commandants, viewed German prisoners not as soldiers entitled to protection under international law, but as criminals who had invaded their country and committed atrocities. The Wehrmacht's conduct in the Soviet Union was documented and undeniable. The siege of Leningrad starved a million civilians. Einsatzgruppen murdered millions. German forces burned villages, shot partisans and commissars without trial, and treated Soviet civilians as subhuman. When Soviet forces captured German soldiers, there was no inclination toward mercy. The prisoners would pay for what their army had done. They would suffer as Soviet citizens had suffered. This was not a secret. Soviet propaganda explicitly told prisoners they would be worked until they repaid their debt for the destruction they'd caused. Fourth, the Geneva Convention didn't apply because the Soviet Union had never ratified it. International law had no binding force. There were no Red Cross inspectors to ensure compliance. There was no diplomatic pressure from neutral nations. The Soviet Union operated behind what would later be called the Iron Curtain, isolated from Western scrutiny, answerable to no one, free to treat prisoners however it wished. Finally, there was simple practicality. The Soviet Union needed labor to rebuild. Millions of Soviet men had died. Who would mine the coal, log the timber, build the railroads? German prisoners were a resource, a workforce that could be exploited without cost, worked until expended, then replaced. It was brutal economic calculation dressed up as justice. The comparison with American treatment reveals not just different outcomes, but different values. America chose to follow international law even when it was expensive and unpopular with some citizens. America chose to see enemy soldiers as human beings who would one day return home and whose treatment would matter for future peace. America made a strategic calculation that generosity would serve long-term interests better than revenge. The Soviet Union made the opposite choices at every turn, and 1 million German prisoners paid with their lives. While Werner Müller died alone in Kazakhstan in March 1943, his wife Anna waited in Hamburg. She had received one postcard in February, a pre-printed form that allowed him to check boxes. I am healthy. I am uninjured. I am being treated well. He had checked the first 2 boxes. The third remained empty. That postcard, delivered 6 weeks after he'd written it, was the last communication she ever received from him. Anna's experience was multiplied across Germany millions of times. Families of soldiers captured on the Eastern Front lived in an agony of uncertainty that stretched for years, sometimes decades. They knew their sons and husbands had been captured. They didn't know if they were alive or dead, suffering or managing to survive, whether they would ever come home. The contrast with families of American-held prisoners was stark and painful. By late 1944, mail service between American camps and Germany was functioning. Prisoners could write letters that were censored but delivered. They could receive packages from home. Families knew their loved ones' locations, their conditions, even their health status. The Red Cross facilitated communication and provided information. When the war ended in May 1945, these families knew their prisoners would be coming home soon, and they did. By the end of 1946, virtually all German prisoners held by American forces were back in Germany. Families of Soviet-held prisoners had no such reassurance. The Soviet Union provided no prisoner list to the Red Cross. Letters from Soviet camps were rare, heavily censored, and often never delivered. The Red Cross was denied access to camps. Soviet authorities simply refused to acknowledge international humanitarian standards. Behind the Iron Curtain, information was controlled absolutely. Families knew nothing. Anna Müller checked every resource available. She registered her husband with the Red Cross's tracing service. She scanned the lists of returned prisoners published in newspapers. She wrote letters to Soviet authorities that went unanswered. She joined groups of other wives and mothers in similar situations, desperate women who gathered to share rumors and scraps of information, hoping against hope that their men were alive somewhere. In 1947, when American-held prisoners were home and rebuilding their lives, Anna was still waiting. In 1950, when the first Soviet-held prisoners began returning, she stood at the Hamburg train station watching skeletal men stumble off trains, searching every face, hoping to see Werner. He was never on those trains. The first major release of Soviet-held prisoners came in 1950, 5 years after the war ended. The men who returned shocked their families. They were physically broken, many missing limbs to frostbite, all carrying diseases, looking decades older than their years. They told stories that were difficult to believe: starvation, death by freezing, labor camps that killed thousands. The horror of what Soviet captivity had meant became clear to German families, and those still waiting felt their hope curdle into dread. Anna's questions grew more desperate. If prisoners were being released, why not Werner? Was he too sick to travel? Was he being held longer for some reason? Or was he already dead, and she was simply waiting for confirmation of what had happened years ago? The uncertainty destroyed families. Some wives, after years of waiting with no information, remarried, only to face agonizing situations when prisoners unexpectedly returned in the 1950s. Children grew up without fathers, many never meeting men who'd been gone since they were infants. The psychological toll was immense. You couldn't grieve properly because there was no confirmation of death. You couldn't move forward because there was always the chance of return. Families existed in limbo, frozen in time, waiting. The Soviet Union occasionally published partial prisoner lists, usually to serve propaganda purposes. German newspapers would print these lists, and the families would desperately scan thousands of names. Finding a loved one's name meant he was alive. At least at the time the list was compiled. Not finding a name meant nothing. The lists were incomplete, often years out of date, and many prisoners were never documented properly. A cruel black market developed. Con artists claimed to have information about Soviet camps and would sell news to desperate families. Some of this information was invented. Some was real but sold to multiple families. The desperate would pay anything for even a scrap of hope. The 1950 releases were selective. The Soviet Union primarily released prisoners captured late in the war who'd been healthier to start with and had thus survived. Those captured early, the Stalingrad prisoners, the men who'd endured the worst years from 1943 to 1945, were mostly dead. Their families' hopes were being kept alive by ignorance. In 1955, West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer traveled to Moscow and negotiated with Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev for the release of remaining German prisoners. This diplomatic mission resulted in the final major release. Approximately 10,000 prisoners came home in 1955 and 1956, a full decade after the war ended. The men who returned in this final wave had been in Soviet captivity for 10 or more years. Many had spent so long in the camps that they'd forgotten their native language, spoke Russian, and struggled to reintegrate into German society. They returned to a country transformed by the economic miracle, unrecognizable from the Germany they'd left. Their families had moved on, built new lives, and the returning prisoners were ghosts from a past everyone wanted to forget. Anna Müller was not among the families reunited. Werner's name never appeared on any list. He never returned. For decades, she lived without confirmation, unable to grieve properly, unable to move forward. Only in 1968, 25 years after his capture, did a German researcher working in newly opened Soviet archives find Werner's death record. Dystrophy, March 1943, buried in mass grave, location unknown. Anna finally had her answer. He had been dead for 25 years. She had spent a quarter century waiting for a man who died 6 weeks after capture. She was 68 years old. She wasted her life waiting for a ghost. Her story was one of millions. Not all German prisoners in Soviet hands remained in POW camps. Tens of thousands disappeared into the Gulag system, the vast network of labor camps that held Soviet political prisoners and were never classified as prisoners of war again. For these men, survival was rare and return was nearly impossible. The line between POW camp and Gulag camp was blurry in practice. Both systems used forced labor, both operated in remote regions, both had horrific conditions. But Gulag camps were worse, if such a distinction is meaningful. POW camps, theoretically, held men who would eventually be released. Gulag camps held people the state wanted to forget. German prisoners transferred to Gulag camps effectively ceased to exist in any official capacity. The transfers happened for various reasons. Some prisoners were accused of war crimes, real or fabricated, and sentenced to hard labor. The definition of war crime was elastic. Serving in certain SS units meant automatic conviction. Being an officer could be enough. Sometimes, possession of anti-Soviet literature, which could mean anything from Nazi propaganda to religious texts, resulted in charges. The trials, when they occurred at all, were perfunctory. Confessions were extracted through torture. Sentences ranged from 10 years to life. Other prisoners were simply redesignated. In the chaos of managing millions of prisoners, Soviet bureaucracy sometimes lost track of who was a POW and who was a criminal prisoner. Papers were lost or falsified. A prisoner might be transferred to a Gulag camp to fill a labor quota and never transfer back. Once inside the Gulag system, there was no process for correction, no appeals, no way to prove you didn't belong there. The Gulag camps were scattered across the Soviet Union's most inhospitable regions. Kolyma, in the Arctic Circle, was among the deadliest. Prisoners there mined gold in temperatures that dropped to minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Death rates at Kolyma exceeded 50%. The journey there alone killed many prisoners. They were transported in ship holds designed for cargo, packed so tightly they couldn't sit, with no sanitation, and many died before arrival. Vorkuta, in the northern Urals, was another killing ground. Prisoners mined coal in tunnels that regularly collapsed. Safety equipment was non-existent. Accidents were common, and medical care was not. Men worked until they died, and their bodies were buried in the permafrost, preserving them in ice for eternity. Magadan, Norilsk, Krasnoyarsk, dozens of other camps. Each name represents thousands of deaths. German prisoners mixed with Soviet political prisoners, with Ukrainian nationalists, with captured Red Army soldiers accused of cowardice, with ordinary Soviet citizens who'd committed the crime of speaking carelessly about Stalin. The Gulag was a vast machine for breaking human beings, and German POWs were fed into it and ground up like everyone else. The disappeared included some high-profile cases. General Friedrich Paulus, commander of German forces at Stalingrad, was held until 1953, but treated relatively well because he was valuable for propaganda. Other officers were not so fortunate. Colonel Helmut von Gottberg, captured in 1944, was accused of partisan killings and sentenced to 25 years. He died in Vorkuta in 1948. His family learned of his death in 1993 when Soviet archives opened. For families, the Gulag transfers meant their loved ones became invisible. POW lists didn't include Gulag prisoners. Red Cross inquiries received no response because the prisoners technically weren't POWs anymore. They were criminals convicted by Soviet courts, and the Soviet Union did not allow foreign interference in its justice system. Families had no way to know if their missing soldier was dead in a POW camp or lost in the Gulag. The scale of the Gulag transfers remains uncertain. Soviet records were deliberately incomplete. Estimates suggest between 50,000 and 150,000 German prisoners ended up in Gulag camps. At some point, many died there. Some were released in the 1950s and returned to Germany with stories of camps even worse than POW camps. Others remained in prison until they died. Mass graves are still being discovered. Since the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991, Russian authorities and German organizations have worked to identify burial sites and recover remains. In Siberia, Kazakhstan, and the Arctic regions, excavations have found mass graves containing hundreds of bodies. Forensic teams work to identify remains through dental records, uniform fragments, identification tags. The work is slow and incomplete. Many graves will never be found. Many bodies will never be identified. One such discovery occurred in 1996 near Tambov, Russia. Archaeologists excavating a site found a mass grave containing over 4,000 bodies, most German prisoners of war who died in 1943. The grave had been unmarked, forgotten, its location lost in bureaucratic chaos. For 50 years, those men simply didn't exist. Their families had waited, wondered, hoped, and never received answers. Now their families, if any survived, at least knew where their loved ones were buried. Similar discoveries continue. In 2006, a grave near Omsk revealed 600 German prisoners. In 2012, remains were found in Voronezh. Each discovery brings closure to a few families, but there are thousands of graves yet to be found, tens of thousands of men whose resting places remain unknown. The disappeared also included ethnic Germans from the Soviet Union. These were Soviet citizens of German ancestry who lived in Russia for generations. When Germany invaded, Stalin viewed them as potential traitors. Many were deported to Kazakhstan. Those who were conscripted into the Wehrmacht and later captured faced the worst treatment. The Soviet Union considered them traitors, not foreign soldiers. They received automatic long sentences and were often executed. Their families in the USSR were persecuted. Their names were erased. They became non-persons in two countries. The disappeared haunt German-Russian relations to this day. In the 1990s and 2000s, as archives opened, families learned the face of men who'd been missing for 50 years. Elderly women, themselves now in their 80s or 90s, finally discovered what happened to husbands and fathers captured in 1943. The news was always grim. Died of starvation in 1944, executed in 1947, lost in the Gulag, and presumed dead. The work continues. German organizations maintain databases of missing soldiers. Russian local historians research camp records. Forensic teams excavate suspected burial sites. The goal is to identify every German soldier lost in Soviet captivity, to give every family closure, to ensure every victim is remembered. But after 80 years, with witnesses dying and records deteriorating, full accounting may never be achieved. Tens of thousands of German soldiers remain disappeared, their fates unknown, their graves unmarked, their families still waiting for answers that may never come. The men who survived Soviet captivity and returned home were alive but barely. They had not been freed. They had been released when their bodies were too broken to extract further labor. What came home to Germany in the 1950s were not the young soldiers who'd marched east a decade earlier, but physical and psychological wrecks who would never fully recover. The first wave of returns in 1950 shocked German society. Trains arrived carrying men who looked like concentration camp survivors, skeletal figures with hollow eyes and shuffling gaits. They weighed 80 or 90 pounds, 50 or 60 pounds less than when they'd been captured. Their faces were aged beyond their years. A man of 30 looked 50. Teeth were missing, lost to scurvy and malnutrition. Hair was prematurely gray or gone entirely. Skin hung loose on frames that had lost all muscle mass. Physical disabilities were universal. Frostbite had claimed fingers, toes, entire feet, ears, and noses. Some men returned with crude prosthetics fashioned in Soviet camps. Others had wounds that never healed properly, chronic infections that Soviet doctors had neither the supplies nor inclination to treat. Tuberculosis ravaged lungs. Dysentery had permanently damaged digestive systems. Hearts weakened by years of starvation struggled to function. These men would never work manual labor again. Many would never work at all. The contrast with American-held prisoners was impossible to ignore. Klaus Becker, who'd shared Sunday dinners in Kansas, returned home in 1946, healthy, well-fed, and ready to rebuild his life. He married, started a business, and lived a full life. Men who spent the same years in Soviet camps returned in 1955 permanently disabled, unable to work, struggling with health problems that would kill many of them within a few years of return. Same war, same capture date, different captor. One man got his life back. The other's life was over, though his body lingered on for decades. The psychological damage was equally severe, though less visible. Today, we diagnose these men with severe post-traumatic stress disorder. In the 1950s, German society had no framework for understanding their condition. The men suffered nightmares that never stopped. Flashbacks to camp scenes, panic attacks triggered by cold weather or the smell of certain foods, survivor guilt that they'd lived while comrades died. Many turned to alcohol to numb the pain. Suicide rates among returned Soviet prisoners were tragically high. Reintegration was nearly impossible. These men returned to West Germany in the midst of its economic miracle. The country was prospering, rebuilding, moving forward. Their families had adapted to their absence, built new lives. Children who'd been infants when their fathers left were now teenagers who didn't know these strangers claiming to be their fathers. Wives had endured years of hardship and moved on emotionally, if not legally. The returning men didn't fit into this new Germany. They were frozen in 1945, traumatized by the decade that followed, unable to participate in the prosperity around them. Society didn't want to hear their stories. West Germany in the 1950s wanted to forget the war, embrace the future, and project optimism. These broken men were uncomfortable reminders of a past everyone preferred to ignore. They spoke of horrors that made people uncomfortable. They challenged the narrative of German victimhood because they'd experienced real victimhood at Soviet hands, which complicated discussions of German responsibility for the war. They were politically inconvenient and socially awkward. Veterans organizations existed, but support was inadequate. Some returned prisoners received small pensions, barely enough to survive on. Medical care was available, but doctors struggled to treat conditions they'd never seen before. Psychological support was essentially non-existent. Men were expected to simply get over their trauma, to move on, to contribute to society. When they couldn't, they were viewed as weak or defective. The comparison with American POW returnees was, again, stark. Men who'd been in American camps integrated smoothly. They spoke positively of their experiences. They learned skills in captivity that helped them in civilian life. They gained weight and health in American camps, not lost it. They became success stories, examples of how even former enemies could find opportunity in post-war Germany. They contributed to positive feelings toward America and aided West Germany's alignment with the West. Soviet camp survivors contributed to the opposite sentiment. They were living proof of Soviet brutality. Their broken bodies testified to what Soviet communism meant in practice. They reinforced West German antipathy toward the Soviet Union and the East German Communist state. They became symbols in Cold War propaganda, examples of why West Germany was right to align with America against Soviet tyranny. But as symbols, they were useful. As human beings trying to rebuild lives, they were largely abandoned. Some survivors attempted to find meaning in their suffering. A few wrote memoirs, documenting their experiences for historical record. These books, published in the 1950s and 60s, provided the world with first-hand accounts of Soviet camp conditions. They're valuable historical sources, but also heartbreaking reads. The author's pain is evident on every page. Writing brought them no peace, only the hope that their suffering might be remembered and might prevent future atrocities. Others retreated entirely from society. Unable to cope with a world that had moved on without them, they lived isolated lives, sustained by small pensions, avoiding human connection that reminded them of all they lost. Family members reported that these men barely spoke, never smiled, and lived as if still imprisoned, their minds never having left the camps even though their bodies had. the medical consequences follow them for life. Men who survived starvation faced chronic health problems. Their bodies, deprived of nutrition during crucial years, never fully recovered. They suffer from digestive problems, weakened immune systems, and heart conditions. Tuberculosis, contracted in camp, remained active for years or returned later in life. The average life expectancy for returned Soviet prisoners was significantly lower than for the general population. Many died in their 50s or 60s, their bodies simply giving out decades earlier than they should have. The final tragedy was that their suffering was minimized. Because Germany had started the war, because the Wehrmacht had committed atrocities in the Soviet Union, some argue that German prisoners had gotten what they deserved. The public conversation focused on German responsibility for the war, not on the treatment of prisoners. Individual suffering was subsumed into larger historical narratives. The men themselves became footnotes, their experiences acknowledged but not dwelt upon, their pain recognized but not fully addressed. To understand why Soviet treatment of German prisoners was so brutal requires confronting uncomfortable historical realities from multiple perspectives. This is not to excuse what happened to men like Werner Müller, but to explain the context in which 1 million Germans died in Soviet captivity. The starting point must be the German invasion itself and the conduct of German forces in the Soviet Union. This was not a conventional military campaign. It was a war of annihilation explicitly designed to destroy the Soviet state, exterminate its Jewish population, and enslave its Slavic peoples. German planning documents outline these goals clearly. The Wehrmacht was not a passive observer. It participated actively in atrocities. The siege of Leningrad, lasting from September 1941 to January 1944, was a deliberate strategy to starve the city into submission. German forces surrounded the city and cut off food supplies. 900 days of siege killed approximately 1 million civilians, most from starvation. This was not an accidental consequence of war, but a calculated policy. German command knew what would happen and intended it. The Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing squads that followed the Wehrmacht into the Soviet Union, murdered over 1.5 million Jews and other civilians in mass shootings. Wehrmacht units provided logistical support, security, and sometimes participated directly in the killings. The myth that the Wehrmacht was uninvolved in atrocities has been thoroughly debunked by historians. Regular German soldiers witnessed, facilitated, and committed war crimes across occupied Soviet territory. Soviet prisoners of war in German hands fared terribly. Of approximately 5.7 million Soviet soldiers captured by Germany, over 3.3 million died in captivity, a death rate of 57%. These men were deliberately starved, worked to death, or executed. German policy classified Soviet soldiers as subhuman and undeserving of Geneva Convention protections. The German treatment of Soviet POWs was, by any measure, genocidal. When Soviet forces began capturing German soldiers in large numbers from 1943 onward, every Soviet citizen and soldier knew what German forces had done. They'd seen the burned villages, the mass graves, the starved survivors of German occupation. They lost family members. The desire for revenge was not abstract, but deeply personal. Soviet soldiers capturing Germans saw men whose army had murdered their mothers, starved their children, destroyed their homes. Soviet ideology also played a crucial role. The Soviet Union operated under a communist system that collectivized suffering and prioritized state needs over individual rights. The Gulag system, which predated the war, already imprisoned millions of Soviet citizens in brutal labor camps. The Soviet state viewed human labor as a resource to be extracted, not as involving people with inherent dignity. German prisoners were simply added to this existing system of exploitation. Stalin's personal cruelty and paranoia influenced policy. He showed no concern for prisoner welfare and viewed German prisoners as resources for Soviet reconstruction. When advisors suggested improving camp conditions to reduce death rates, Stalin's response was essentially that dead Germans were justice for dead Soviets. Prisoner deaths were not a problem required solution, but an acceptable outcome of righteous punishment. Practical considerations matter too. The Soviet Union in 1943 and 1944 was barely surviving. The country was devastated. Resources were scarce. Soviet civilians were starving. In this context, prioritizing prisoner welfare over the needs of Soviet citizens was politically impossible and morally questionable from a Soviet perspective. Why feed German invaders when Soviet children were hungry? The absence of international oversight enabled brutality. The Soviet Union hadn't signed the Geneva Convention. It didn't allow Red Cross access. It operated behind closed borders with no foreign observers. There was no external pressure to treat prisoners humanely. No consequences for violations. No accountability. Comparing Soviet and American treatment reveals these factors clearly. America had resources. Having experienced no home front devastation, America followed international law and allowed oversight. America made strategic calculations about post-war relations. American ideology emphasized individual rights. American society hadn't experienced invasion or atrocity on its soil. All these factors enabled generosity toward prisoners. The Soviet Union had none of these advantages and many reasons for revenge. This doesn't justify the death of 1 million German prisoners, but it explains why Soviet treatment differs so drastically from American treatment. The moral question remains: were Soviet actions justified? German forces committed atrocities. Soviet citizens suffered immensely. Does this justify letting German prisoners starve? Most modern observers would say no. Revenge, however understandable, violated basic human rights. Prisoners should be treated humanely regardless of what their country did. Two wrongs don't make a right. But this moral clarity is easier from our distance and prosperity. Soviet citizens in 1943, starving in ruins while German prisoners demanded food, might view the question differently. Moral judgments must acknowledge context without abandoning principle. What's clear is that the choice existed. America proved that treating prisoners humanely was possible even during total war. The Soviet Union made a different choice, and the 1 million German prisoners paid the price. The legacy of German prisoners in Soviet camps extends far beyond the individual tragedies. It shaped Cold War politics, German-Soviet relations, and ongoing debates about justice, revenge, and the rules of war. For decades after World War II, Soviet treatment of German POWs remained a source of tension between West Germany and the Soviet Union. West German politicians demanded full accounting of prisoner deaths. Soviet authorities refused, citing German war crimes as justification for their actions. The issue became propaganda fodder for both sides. The West portrayed Soviet camps as evidence of communist brutality. The East highlighted German atrocities as justification for harsh treatment. German-Russian relations today still carry echoes of this history. Modern Germany has built strong relationships with Russia, but the prisoner issue remains sensitive. Families continue seeking information about missing relatives. Joint historical commissions work to identify remains and document deaths. The cooperation is real, but so are the lingering tensions. The opening of Soviet archives after 1991 revolutionized understanding of the camps. Historians gained access to documentation previously secret. Death records, camp reports, and policy documents revealed the systematic nature of prisoner mistreatment. Families finally learned what happened to loved ones missing for 50 years. The information brought closure, but also confirmed worst fears. Most families learned their missing soldiers had died decades earlier, often within months of capture. Memorials now mark former campsites. In Russia, Germany, and former Soviet republics, monuments honor the dead. These memorials serve multiple purposes: remembering the victims, educating new generations, and symbolizing reconciliation. They acknowledge suffering without assigning complete blame to either side. They recognize that prisoners were victims even if their country was the aggressor. The historical lesson is complex. Soviet brutality to war prisoners was real and resulted in 1 million deaths that could have been prevented. Yet German forces' conduct in the Soviet Union was equally brutal and killed tens of millions. Both truths must be acknowledged. Recognizing Soviet prisoner mistreatment doesn't diminish German responsibility for starting a war of annihilation. Recognizing German atrocities doesn't justify letting prisoners starve. The contrast between American and Soviet treatment demonstrates that choices existed. America proved that following international law, treating enemies humanely, and maintaining civilized standards during total war was possible. These choices require resources and will, but they were achievable. America chose generosity and strategic foresight. The result was 400,000 German prisoners returning home healthy and becoming advocates for American values. That investment paid massive dividends in the Cold War and beyond. The Soviet Union made different choices, whether from revenge, ideology, practical necessity, or some combination. Soviet policy resulted in catastrophic prisoner deaths. The long-term consequences were arguably counterproductive. Dead prisoners couldn't contribute to rebuilding. Survivors returned as broken propagandists for anti-Soviet sentiment. The brutality fed Western narratives about communist inhumanity and complicated post-war diplomacy. The lesson for today is that how victors treat the defeated matters. Revenge feels satisfying but creates cycles of violence. Justice requires balancing accountability for crimes with basic human dignity for all prisoners. International law exists for reasons validated by the contrast between American and Soviet camps. Following it serves everyone's long-term interest. We return to our opening story. Two soldiers, captured on the same day in February 1943. Klaus Becker, taken by Americans, went to Kansas, gained weight, learned English, returned home in 1946, and lived until 1998. He raised a family, ran a business, and told stories about American kindness that shaped his children's worldview. Werner Müller, taken by Soviets, marched into Siberia, starved, and died in March 1943. His wife waited 12 years before giving up hope. She learned he was dead 25 years after his death. He left no children. His life ended at 23. His story multiplied 1 million times represents the cost of revenge over justice, brutality over law, ideology over humanity. Both men were German soldiers in a terrible war started by their country. Both had fought for an evil regime. Both bore some measure of responsibility for being part of the Wehrmacht. Yet their fates, determined entirely by which army captured them, could not have been more different. One came home, one never came home. The difference was not fate, but choice. Choices made by nations about how to treat defeated enemies, choices with consequences that echo 80 years later. That difference between coming home and never coming home, between life and death, between mercy and revenge, tells us everything we need to know about why international law matters, why basic human dignity must be maintained even in war's darkest moments, and why the rules of civilization are most important when they're hardest to follow. Werner Müller's story deserved a different ending. So did the stories of the million men who died with him. May we remember them, learn from their fate, and choose better when faced with similar decisions.